Many professors of preaching talk about the need to emphasize one central idea in a sermon. Why is it important to stick to one big idea in a sermon?
Basically because it is biblical. When we look at a pericope or a biblical passage, to put it in simple terms, each paragraph deals with one main subject. So when we are preaching from that one main passage, or even if we are preaching topical sermons, we should have one central idea. Otherwise, what happens is, in many sermons, we hear too many ideas. I just heard a sermon last week in a particular setting, which I will not mention, but the preacher was all over the place. At the end of the day, I was not sure as to what he was trying to say. He said a lot of good things. He was not a false preacher or anything as such. He said a lot of good things, a lot of value. But what was his main idea? There was no clue. So we must focus on one central idea. Some preachers preach sermons as if they're going to preach their last sermon. Of course, we need to preach in that way, in a sense. But then, you don't have to preach through Genesis to Revelation in one single sermon. So we must focus on one single idea. Because when we do that, the audience is also clear as to what they are listening. And we are, first of all, clear in our own mind as to what we are preaching. The central idea is also called as big idea. Some people call it as proposition. Some call it as central proposition of the sermon. Some call it the homiletical idea or the main idea. Several terms are used, Pastor, but we need to have one single idea for each sermon. This is what I see missing in several sermons today. People don't write out one single sentence summary of their sermons. If you ask them what you're preaching, they tell about a whole lot of things. All of us, as we prepare sermons, should be able to summarize our entire sermon in one single sentence. If we have done that, then we're really ready to preach. Brian Chappell, in his book, Christ-Centered Preaching, talks about the 3 a.m. test. He says that suppose you're preaching on a Sunday morning, and if somebody were to wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and ask you, what is your message about? That's not the time to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to start with my introduction and I'm going to share this illustration in the introduction. Then I'll give my main points, my sub-points are this, my conclusion is this, and so on. No, not all those things. He says we should be able to summarize our entire sermon in one single sentence, which is the proposition or the big idea or the main message or whatever term we use. He says, even in the middle of the night, if we're not able to tell the proposition, then we're not ready to preach. Because what happens is when we go to the pulpit, we are confused in our mind as to what we want to share. So we should be able to preach and in such a way that we have a clear summary statement in our mind as to what we're going to preach. So every sermon must have a proposition. Every sermon must have one single idea. It helps us as preachers and helps people also to have that one main takeaway from the sermon, which is lacking in so many sermons today.